Hello, everyone, and welcome to Red Clover Advisors Spring Clean Your Data Mapping and Retention Strategies. We're going to get started here in just a few moments. We have everyone coming on in to our virtual room over here. We're excited for you to join us today. We have a lot to cover. We do these 30-minute snack size webinars. We're excited to dig in. All right. Joining me today, so let's do a little introduction. I'm Jodi Daniels. I'm the CEO and privacy consultant here at Red Clover Advisors, and I'm delighted to be joined by James. And James, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. James Sherer. I'm a partner in BakerHostetler's New York office. I co-lead our emerging tech team within our digital assets and data management group. Our areas of practice within the emerging tech team, we handle, it sounds made up, and it is like a lot of things, but it is a combination of the blockchain cryptocurrency practice, the information governance, record retention practice, and the practice side non-IP artificial intelligence practice. So all those things pitched together to help organizations kind of develop programs and a lot of the policies and documentation and notice requirements around them.
Wonderful. And thank you so much. And a quick admin item for everyone joining. This will be recorded. It will be sent out. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will do our best to get to them. And if not, we'll address them post the webinar. In our mind, every data record maintained increases a company's privacy and security risk. And here today, we're going to talk a lot about how do we conduct an effective data inventory? How do we think about minimizing all of that data? And it's really important to conduct the data inventory so we know how to minimize the data. And then part of that minimization is creating a data retention program. And we'll talk more about that as well. Like I just shared, our goals for today: conducting a successful data inventory. What are the common challenges? And we'll give you some tips to work through those. The importance of deleting data and actionable steps for you to be able to take. Why do we conduct a personal data inventory? Well, in my mind, this is the foundation of a privacy program. It's so important. One, regulations require us to create, maybe you've heard of a record of processing activity, a ROPA, an Article 30 report, a data map, a data inventory. They all have slightly synonymous names, but generally speaking, a list of the kind of data that you're processing, collecting, using, storing. It helps us manage all the different privacy risks that might exist in your organization. The data inventory helps us inform where those risks might be and helps us figure out what to do with them. It's really hard to honor privacy rights requests if you have no idea where the data is, and not just where the data is, but what you're using it for, and determining if there's any exemptions or exceptions that you might be able to have there. We also have vendor management obligations. And again, it's a bit challenging to know where your vendors and third parties are if we haven't conducted a thorough data inventory. And of course, we want to make sure that all those third parties and vendors are adhering to the privacy and security obligations that we want to make sure that they are adhering to on our behalf. Incident management. Well, if there's any type of privacy or security incident, knowing where the data is and what type and how we got it and where it is going to be very important. And of course, we have security measures. We want to ensure that we are securing all the data that we have, and we need to know where it is for us to be able to secure it. James, what might you add here in terms of the importance of data inventories?
I think just highlighting two of these points as far as like the practical implications they've had with clients. So one is when you're thinking about all of this, so it's really in really the first three: regulatory, privacy, risk, individual rights. Are you maintaining records? Do you, and if so, where are you maintaining them? In a place where you can be confident that you can get the information if you need it, that you can manage it in a way that you may be required to for a regulatory purpose. If you're asked for a copy of something, if the institution is required to maintain something under law, and or you're supposed to delete it if you've got data subject rights request asking for deletion. So knowing that you have something and then knowing where it is and the way in which it's managed. I mean, those are three parts of that process that are pretty critical in answering to different outside constituencies. Speaking of outside constituencies, that vendor management. We've seen so much more of a movement to the uses of cloud providers, third-party service providers, uh, to maintain different parts of operations. You move to the cloud, you get some efficiencies, you get people who are expert in different ways that you might not be. But have you really provided for who's managing the records of the organization? Who manages that data? You might say, oh, well, so and so is managing this part of the process for us. They have the records. We would go to them. But if you check the contract or you even check the expectations of that third party, they might say, hey, we manage our records for the work that we do. Some of which is on your behalf. We don't manage your information. So making sure that you've taken a really deep dive into that vendor management, which is only becoming more important as the kind of those layers or boundaries between organizations get more diffuse.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. Which leads us to how do we actually find the data? So we're going to spend a few minutes on how to conduct a data inventory. First, these are just a couple examples of personal information. And I think it's also really important to remember a data inventory is essential in identifying sensitive personal information. Keep in mind that depending on the jurisdiction you're in and the privacy laws you have to adhere to, that definition of sensitive data might differ. Oftentimes, we find data inventories might be started by security teams, and they might think you have to have contact information and financial information and social security number. And lucky us in privacy, you just need one of these to really need to comply. So make sure you're aware of the kind of personal information and the jurisdictions and where you are. Then at Red Clover, we really like to focus on the business process activities. This aligns with the ROPA, that record of processing activity GDPR requires. And we think about the different parts of an organization. This is just a few: marketing, IT, finance, HR, product. Think about your organization. Think about maybe the functional departments. And what are the business processes? What are the things that people are actually doing in each one of those functions? Just a couple examples under marketing. Email marketing is very different than targeted ads. You're all here on a webinar. You provided your email to be able to participate. That is a marketing activity. In HR, we have onboarding and recruiting and payroll and performance review. Those are different processing activities. When we look at the business process, we're able to follow it through, like, how is data moving through the organization to be able to understand that collection, use, storing, and sharing. If we think about the personal inventory process, again, it's all about that life cycle. And these are going to be some of the key questions that should be asked and documented as a part of that data inventory. Collection. What are you actually collecting? Referring back to that personal information and the different types, and how are you receiving that information? Are you collecting anything from children? That might spark a variety of different requirements. And the first piece is just, do you collect from them? And then remember, we said it's going to help you identify privacy risk. Then we come back and understand what that privacy risk is, and are we doing it, or do we need to do something different? What about the use of data? Literally, how are we using that? Where is it being stored? What are those third parties? What cloud providers is it being sent to, and who are these people? We have an entire collection of selling, sharing, cookie, consent management from every law that's out there that we have to sort through. If you have cross-border issues and data transfers, you might have to contend with that. We have quality and accuracy, the security measures, and retention. So as I go through a webinar business process, I should be thinking about, I collect name and email, I store it in HubSpot, I keep it for how long? If it was international, do I have any cross-border data transfer issues? Who is this HubSpot company? What are they doing with that information? And I should train the people who are responsible as a part of all of this. If I think about personal data inventory creation and maintenance, well, we've kind of talked about how do you get started. Many of you have probably already gotten started. And the challenging piece is, how do you maintain it? How do you keep it going? I'm going to share what we have seen to be successful. And James, then I'd love to turn it to you for you to also offer where your clients are incorporating data inventories in their practices. When people are creating a new process, a new product, a new system, a new fill in the blank, that is a great time to raise the flag and say, wait, what are we doing that's new? And do we already have that captured in a data inventory, or do we need to add it now? If there's a change in a process, we're already doing a marketing activity, but we're going to do it a little different. Maybe it's a new provider, or we're adding 3 new data fields, or now, real life story, once a client was US only for webinars. Now it was moving internationally and it wanted to understand what were its obligations. Are we going to now share data with a new third party? Maybe we fired the old CRM and we're bringing in a new one. What do we need to consider when we do that? And ultimately, who are these third parties and what is happening with them? So James, I turn it to you and I'd love to hear, where are you finding companies be successful in updating and maintaining their data inventories?
When they're forced to. It remains a challenge because it can be an additional step to work that's you're already trying to perform. And it's not often that we're dealing with clients who are trying to find things to do. Although I did run into an exception last week about that. So for the most part, we've already got challenges and resources. So we try to make it as easy and perhaps more importantly, as integrated into a process as possible, and using motivation to get these things done. And by which I mean, can we tie this task of getting information about a new initiative, or a change in an existing one, or even just looking at like legacy programs, which now are subject to new laws, which we've seen all of those certainly on a pretty consistent basis. So how do we do that on a practical level? We make it somebody or multiple people's responsibilities. I mean, you have to have that for accountability, and maybe you give people new titles or new roles, and commensurate money. This is new work often, and it's a continuation. So we have to be realistic about that. If we've got existing technologies that we can deploy and integrate this into, I think we've seen more success there. If we've got different platforms that operate as part of that intake process, or maybe annual updates for the way in which organizations use information, can we update those to accommodate for new legal requirements and like practical approaches? And can we tie this to processes that people already need to do? So do you have to go through procurement to kick off a new process? Well, if you're going and asking for money, that's a great time for me to ask you for more information about this. Likewise, if I'm going to use a third party, or someone's trying to contract to do something for me, rather than going back after the fact and saying, oh, and by the way, for the work that you're doing for us, how does all of this work? Get them to fill it out beforehand and then double check it after. So it's like some practical ideas. Use this as part of the intake process for new initiatives. Put it on if you're trying to get support or approvals internally, to say, okay, well, we want to support this, and this new business initiative looks great, and I can see how it's going to be amazing for your unit or your business process. But for us to move it forward, we just need to collect this prospectively. This is what we need. Here's a way to do it, and it becomes part of our file. And then we've integrated in as support of an initiative rather than like an after effect.
One of the other areas I've seen really successful is in a PMO. If there's any type of checklist or project management activity, that we include privacy as a part of that process. And that's been another area. Just really quickly, when we think about this documentation, here's kind of an example of a marketing activity. You're right. We have a company, we're getting data. Maybe it came from the website. It goes to multiple databases, multiple people might have access, which could be internal or external. And then the whole point of that was an email. So if we just sort of think about it, not only from just basic nuts and bolts of privacy, but we think about what are we really trying to do? I find this visual really helps clients and companies understand, if I'm a piece of data, how do I travel through the organization? And that's what we're trying to do for all the different business processing activities that we have. It is a manual process. A lot of times, even if it's automated in some of the solutions, you still have to have some human conversations to understand the how and why data is processed. It's sometimes hard to get that visibility, like we just talked about. Keeping it up to date with some of the suggestions that James and I shared is really important. we do often see that data inventories, no one knows anything about data retention. So we're excited to dive into the data retention piece next to hopefully elevate everyone's data inventories. But I often hear, I don't know, unsure, unlimited, for how long we keep data. And then if your data inventory isn't in a place that is auditable, that's findable, James, you mentioned, right? Where is this being kept? It's really important to have a central place, whether this is an Excel, a OneTrust, any other of the big software providers out there. Somehow, we don't want every team doing their own version. We want a central place where there's a owner who knows how to maintain it and be able to update and do the reporting. And there's a lot of process that you can create to make what seems really complicated a lot simpler. And this is a perfect segue into the data retention piece. So the whole idea, data inventory, we need to know what we have for a long list of reasons. And focusing on this data retention piece, many of the new jurisdictions or all the laws coming are emphasizing this idea: keep less, collect less, only collect what you need. Well, one of the great ways of how to figure out, are we doing that, is through this data retention, or this data inventory process rather. And then we apply a data retention process to it. As we've conducted our data inventory, we should be reviewing, do we need all this? Do we actually have to keep all of it? And if we're collecting too much at the beginning, that's a great place to be able to go back to that functional area and say, well, maybe we should review, did we really need this? And the next time forward, let's think about it a little bit differently. We're going to talk about those data retention policies, how to set those data retention schedules. Those are really important. We just have the policy and no one does anything with it. You just have an electronic policy. And to make that effective, we really need to train the team, because we have people who have to exercise on these pieces alongside potentially some technology that might help you. James, I'd love to hear your thoughts here, and then we'll shift over into this data retention piece.
Well, it's interesting, like even reading that number one, identify what data you hold. Is it all necessary? And that all necessary still goes both ways. And we'll talk about this in more detail the second half of the discussion. But we're finding ourselves in a bind with traditional record practice and these obligations to maintain records for certain minimum periods of time, and environments where, except for cost and costs associated with different things, you weren't really going to get in trouble for maintaining information longer than a required purpose. You weren't even required to really justify why you had it. It was just more a matter of, well, there's a cost associated with getting rid of it, then we'll just maintain it. And storage continues to get cheaper, and somebody might ask for something, even though it's unlikely that they will. But now we've got certainly pressures for e-discovery and spoliation claims on one side, along with increased regulatory scrutiny of certain areas where they expect to see the write once, read many records, like broker-dealer type areas. They got a lot of publicity because it's in the banking sector, and big money fines because it's in the banking sector. So you've got those pressures on one side, and then you flip over to this idea of privacy by design, data minimization, that also speaks to decreased costs within e-discovery response, decreased costs for data security incident response, and more concentrated and less vulnerable network topologies. It's a fascinating play, but I will say none of it gets better if you don't do any work. So
right. So speaking about data deletion and minimization principles, here's our straight from the law minimization principles. So James, take it away.
Sure. Well, I mean, GDPR, obviously, like the international sensibilities, the Brussels principles, wagging the proverbial tail of the dog, to seek international considerations, and then we've got California on the other side trying to tilt the United States in that way, and both are really looking at this and saying, we had a period of time where we created a lot of information, and like that digital explosion of information and records that just didn't exist. And when I say records, it's little r, records of behaviors and what people were doing. As divorce attorneys will tell you, suddenly we have evidence that's being created that just never existed before. We wouldn't have thought of those things as being published, and suddenly they're being created and at scale. And that's a recognition within the privacy laws of saying that's valuable information to individuals to whom it relates, and it's valuable information to organizations, but that doesn't mean you just get to capture it all and keep it. It can also represent a lot of risk. How do we evaluate that with like this inherent rights lens to say you just can't keep everything for all time? There is a reasonability here to it, and we're not going to make it the responsibility of the individual to figure out what the organizations have done. Let's flip that around. So organizations, if you're dealing with this information, and from a behavioral economist point of view, it's very valuable. Knowing what people have done helps you market to what they're going to do. So if you're going to play in that space as an organization, you have to recognize that these laws are becoming much more insistent on evaluating why you have information you have, what you've told the data subjects about it, and what you're doing with it, and when you're getting rid of it. And I think the CCPA, we've seen that even with these ideas for the first time. You've got regulations that require notice. So notice requirements for how long and why you maintain certain categories of sensitive personal information. I mean, wonderful for consumers, in this case, California residents, broadly speaking, and further requirements for organizations to dig in and actually understand what they're doing in their process. It doesn't come without challenges. I think those are pretty straightforward. I'd love your thoughts here too, Jodi. It's just where we see, I mean, lack of executive support, that one's a little bit different. I've got like a self-selection bias because if you've come to me, you already understand, like, it's not inexpensive to speak with me about these topics. Like you've already made an investment of time into it. And I probably speak with more attorneys than not, but that's not to say that I don't speak with privacy professionals, information governance professionals, people I know through these spaces and the professional organizations like the IAPP, ARMA, AIM, ACIDS. Uh, these organizations that have professionals devoted to these issues. So if you come to see me, I hope you've got some executive support, and our bills aren't going to get bounced. But that doesn't mean that the time and resources have been increased. It's almost this expectation that, oh, of course you're doing this maintenance as you go along, but that's not the case, because the fires end up being more pressing, and data that's being collected and available doesn't represent the same immediate challenge unless and until you have a data security incident that you recognize you've compromised data you shouldn't have. You shouldn't have even maintained it. And like some of the worst have been, going back to your earlier slides, in our heads. And I worked on one where the client suddenly realized they did have children's data. They just never put up any kind of barriers to its collection through their app. And voila, when they started to evaluate this, really evaluating the data and mapping it for the first time. And I really shouldn't be the first person to map your data. I'll say that. That is not a cost-effective risk mitigation measure. And recognizing those challenges. So the time and the resources, I guess the silver lining here is, if you've got a data security incident, if you have an e-discovery requirement, you'll find the time and resources, and the competing priorities will start to fade away. But it also ends up being the most expensive way to deal with it. It just is. The last minute priority rates pressing, and then you lose your night and weekends, is something that if you smooth it out, you can deal with it much more effectively prospectively. And that comes to the budget part too. If you wait, you will get it done. And for all the procrastinators or whatever they say, like you can still get it done last minute, but you've also encumbered yourself with a lot of stress, additional cost, and a lot more potential risk.
So, James, I realized I was supposed to launch some polls here, and so I have neglected to do that. So we're going to launch a poll here really quickly. I got so excited that I just forgot to launch these polls. So if everyone could answer, does your company have a records policy and defensibly delete data? So I'm going to give everyone just a few moments and see what you all answer. We might do these like rapid fire here. And then once we do that, I was thinking, James, we could move into the idea of retention, floor, and ceiling.
Sure.
All right. So I'm going to end our poll here, share our results so everyone can see. It looks like we have a lot of people who have a policy, but some confusion over what we're actually doing with it. Some people aren't quite sure if we delete anything. Some people have one and delete, but a third of you. And then some people, we don't delete anything. So thank you for participating. I might squeeze in one more really quickly. So James, back to you on retention floor.
Well, and this is a challenge. You think of it as a collar. I work with my colleague Luke Record, who some of the attendees might know, and Luke loves digging into this, where you've got these floors for records and their retention that are articulated in laws, state or federal law in the U.S. and then internationally. Records and information you'd expect to be maintained by an organization and that they rely upon. And then you've got the ceilings, where they're saying under the privacy laws and certain data security paradigms you shouldn't maintain this information longer than you need it. And in between, there's almost this business purpose slash expectation of reasonable use. And tied to that further is the idea that when we think of a record, a quote unquote big R record of an organization, under some laws, that doesn't mean it's a piece of paper or even it's more a collection of certain data points and elements that you would expect to see. ERISA is a great example that we use pretty frequently. It is a compilation of information that a regulator would expect to see related to certain points in time. So you've got record keeping and you're maintaining it in a broader picture, but you're responsible for all those data points and keeping them maintained. And that's where your operational issues are that speak to a data map. You have to have that process mapped out and appreciate that certain third parties may be maintaining parts of those information too. So you've got to do that. You're making sure you have everything available and then running it through the process to make sure you only maintain it as long as you need to and you're maintaining it securely.
And I think this next one, we have a variety of different slides that start talking about different case studies and requirements. And just in the spirit of time, we might not go through all of them, but again, you'll receive this recording in the slides, so you'll be able to reference all of them. James, are there any in particular that you might want to call out? And I know we also have another one that kind of compares GDPR and CCPA too.
Well, the Arthur Andersen case just speaks to generally you've got opportunities to maintain according to business purpose. You get to decide for a lot of things that are articulated within specific regulatory requirements. But then you've got the data privacy on the back end, where you do have to think now. You've got other stakeholders who have investments into their information. But the information, again, I think the last cases here with the metadata, it's not just, like I said, the four corners of a document that you think of for a record. No, now we're starting to think of data points as being assembled in. The broker-dealer concerns about communication and expectations for those that you saw some of the sanctions and fines, that comes from communication takes a lot of different forms, but it's the substance there that truly is the record that you're required to maintain. And you don't know until you know. There's a lot of unknowns out there, or the unknown unknowns, unless and until you undertake a data inventory process or get somebody that's deposed. And under deposition, they'll remember a lot of stuff that may not have come up in casual conversation, but you might have been appraised of if you had the opportunity and wherewithal to undertake a data inventory project.
Right. I think that makes sense. So I think let's look at this one maybe, James, to try and tie out to some of the practical pieces in terms of why keeping too much can be a challenge, a liability.
I think we've hit these in passing, right? Data breach, ransomware attack. If you've got too much or in one spot, then you're going to be unable to do your business. And it's going to be a crazy high cost for a data breach. If you've never deleted anything, a lot of that information, all it does is add to the risk on your balance sheets. In enforcement, that's a challenge because you have to defend that practice. Also, then with enforcement and litigation and class action, you're facing these giant data volumes that come with a cost to remediate them and evaluate them according to legal holds. Just the more stuff you have, those processes are going to blossom out. Creating more work for me, and God bless, but my preference would be to work with you on prospectively managing these things. Finally, the consumer request, it's both, there's two parts to this. One is you've increased cost. If you have a bunch of information and you've got to hunt it all down, in response to, we call it consumer request, it's really data subject request here. Bigger picture, more work. Bigger pile of information, more work to do that. Also, if you're maintaining information that you shouldn't, then you are at higher risk of contacting a consumer in a way that the consumer wouldn't expect and might have a problem with. Not just if they've asked for information to be deleted, but if their circumstances have changed and it seems weird. Like Europe's more in front of that, but we're getting there in the US. When you do that, if you reach out to a consumer who's not happy to hear from you, you have incentivized that consumer to complain. And the California AG's office even has set up intake to say, if you're bothered by this, let us know. Give us probable cause to go and investigate someone who bothered you about your data. So
as a recap, data inventories, make sure you have one, create a plan to update them. Identify all those different third parties. Again, the plan and process for data inventories is what I want you to leave with here today. And we talked about some of those particular steps earlier, as well as having a policy and training employees. And James, any extra thoughts on data retention that you want to add with our extra tips here?
I mean, I think this is pretty straightforward. Just think about it logically. And what I'd add here too, in addition to like running a program and spending time with it, two things. One is even little bits help. You don't have to do everything at once, right? The famous maxim here is you don't need to boil the ocean. Every bit of cleaning helps. You clean out one room in your home, it is an additive benefit. You are creating benefits and mitigating some risk. And we're also thinking about like what is the prospective ways in which we can do these things. Better data governance leads to better data use, which really is the fuel for most organizations that we see.
Thank you so much. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Again, here's our contact information. If you have any questions about what you heard here today, please reach out to both of us. We're also really both active on LinkedIn, and we would love to connect with you there as well. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.